Welcome to the Roaring Twenties, chapter 22. Now, last chapter, at the end of the chapter, they had one thing on racial tensions in America. And I didn't cover this in much detail, but the Tulsa Race Massacre. Now, it used to be called the Tulsa Race Riots. Think about what is a riot and what is a massacre. A riot is caused by people who are out of control and they need to be suppressed. That's what this was referred to for 80 years. And then it was covered up. And then lo and behold, no, it wasn't a riot. It was a massacre. In the state of Oklahoma, the National Guard was called in, not to try to protect people, but to help a white mob attack black citizens in the Greenwood district. And hundreds were killed in what was one of the worst instances of racial violence in this country, and is another dark legacy on this country. So that's especially important for Oklahoma because we live here and it is part of this history, and it's something that has come to new attention lately. That is also part of, in some ways, oftentimes that story is told as part of the Roaring Twenties and the clash of cultures. So this chapter is called the Clash of Cultures, because society is changing so rapidly. And so you have these racial tensions, which creates this clash. You also have a clash between traditional conservative values, women's traditional roles, for example. But now you have flappers where men and women are hanging out together, and they may not be married, and young people, and they're wild and out of control. And Margaret Sanger has been advocating for birth control, for which she's put in jail just for even mentioning birth control. And all hell is broken loose in society, and we don't control these young people anymore. And automobiles, increasing promiscuity, and all this stuff. So it's really interesting. Another clash of culture, too, would be new religious conflict, because you had the Scopes trial, which was about evolution, and traditionalists and conservatives are trying to keep evolution from being taught in schools because they feel that it is a direct conflict with the Bible. And that's part of the clash of cultures, too. And then you have consumerism that takes off in the Jazz Age because of the automobile and the radio, which is really mass media. The radio has a huge influence, and its power cannot be understated, for sure, because later Adolf Hitler will come to understand the power of the radio, and Franklin Roosevelt in his fireside chats will come to understand it. The section about flappers is good. The Harlem Renaissance is African Americans find rebirth within their culture, but also new power for them as they begin to try to push for the failure of Reconstruction and for individual liberties. And the Great Migration had led them to be able to have a new identity. And that's expressed in authors like Langston Hughes and in advocates like Marcus Garvey. And those are really interesting as well. There's more about modernism, like I said, science, evolution, but also Albert Einstein. And then there's nativism, big time nativism. Nativism as in, we got all these new immigrants, like my grandfather who was Polish, and he came in this country in 1913, and they don't speak English. They're Catholic, and so they worship the Virgin Mary and not Jesus and God, and they have these strange rituals, and they're ignorant. Oh, and they take people's jobs. And stop me if you've heard this before, that's called nativism. And it's not new just in the last decade or two. It was big in the 1920s, so big that they actually passed laws to keep people like my grandfather from coming into this country. And they were effective because it really helped to stop the flow of people from Southern and Eastern Europe. Italians, Slavs, Jews. There was a huge nativist reaction, and that was often led by groups like the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, which became, and if you look at the picture on page 828, there's a famous image of a rally. And notice in that rally, they're not hiding their faces. They're not ashamed. The KKK boasted millions of members, and they were proud because that's how they identified white nationalism. They thought this country was supposed to be a white Christian nation and other people shouldn't be here. Stop me if you've heard this before, right? Great replacement theory, stuff like that. And so they get these laws passed, and there was violence too because of groups like the KKK. And that's part of nativism. It's also part of that racial tension. It's also part of that clash of cultures, because honestly, America's never been a white Protestant nationalist country. It has always been multicultural and multi-religious, but there are some people who still then and today wanted to view it like that. And then prohibition. Prohibition is really interesting because it's part of the progressive movement, and it's like, if we can just get rid of alcohol, we can solve so many problems. And there's truth to that, because of course drugs and alcohol do create a lot of problems in society. So it speaks to the ambition of the prohibition of the progressive movement to solve a lot of society's problems. But there's a darker underside to the prohibition movement, and that is related to that immigration, because these new immigrants, they are much more permissive with alcohol. And in other words, they're a bunch of drunks. And the pure Protestant people abstain from alcohol, and these people are undermining American values, and they're turning us into this drunken society where we're going to just go to hell in a handbasket. And that's kind of a viewpoint of the prohibitionist at this time. It's amazing they got that amendment passed. It's the only amendment that's ever been ratified that actually restricted people's freedom. So I think it's not surprising then it's also the only amendment that failed and was repealed some 14 years later. So that was prohibition. The economy is booming at the time, and part of that is because of that consumerism, but that growth is creating what we call an economic bubble. And the whole thing, the roaring 20s, the partying, the Great Gatsby, the focus on consumerism and materialism and wealth and everything like that, the party's coming crashing down. They don't know it yet, but October 1929, it's going to hit, the Great Depression. And that cannot be understated, how serious and terrible the Great Depression. There's more stuff, presidential politics and things like that, but that's where we're headed. We're headed to the Great Depression. We're headed to another World War. They're related to each other, just as World War II is related to World War I, cause and effect on all of these things. And so this interwar period, it's often an overlooked, but it's a really interesting and really necessary part of history. So I hope you enjoy studying it. And as usual, just please send me an email if you have any questions. Shoot me a rough draft if you have not been getting A's on your discussion essays, and I'm happy to help you along with that. So thanks for watching, and see you next week with the Great Depression.